So these people were really smart when they put certain phrases in that some of the people who wanted to keep certain people down either didn't catch, weren't educated enough to understand what it meant, but some of those things went through. And it, like the phrase, all men are created equal. And for me, to restructure it, I mean, there are mistakes in the Constitution. I would take men out and put mankind in. Because that would include everything.
Everybody.
Children, women,
oh, there you go.
men.
Nice.
It would include everyone.
So, okay, back to the 14th Amendment, just so we're clear for the audience. So the 14th Amendment essentially gave civil rights to the slaves who were now newly freed and made them citizens, correct? And then what happened was then they slowly, the boiled frog thing, whereas we were just, the rest of the people, men, were considered, free naturally under God, and having never been enslaved, having never allowed themselves to be enslaved. I mean, speaking from a Muslim standpoint, it's forbidden to allow yourself to be enslaved. So that's just another argument or another interesting aside there. But so, slowly they worked in the general man into that same citizenship, which now, instead of having your inalienable rights given to you by God, now you are a citizen, you are now a subject to the government, and now all your so-called rights are actually privileges now granted to you by the government, which is clearly controlled, essentially controlled by the crown back in England. So everybody's just become subjects again. It took them a few years to work that in, but essentially they just got right back on top again.
I mean, absolutely, but it wasn't a few years. It was instantaneously when pen went to paper.
Oh.
Because most people don't realize that there are 4 structured paragraphs of the 14th Amendment. People are only ever shown one. Okay, paragraph 2 of the 14th Amendment clearly dictates that U.S. citizens have no right to question the debt of their government in any way, shape, or form. They are simply obliged to pay it.
Interesting.
So instantly, you're a slave. Someone else is spending all the wealth and all the money and doing all the things, and you'll shut up and pay it and like it.
Yeah.
That's what it says. You're a slave. Right. I don't care if you don't have shackles, if you don't have somebody with a gun to your head, you're still a slave. You're paying all of their bills. You're paying their shopping spree, their lavish lifestyle. And basically, what happened at the end of the Revolution, not the Revolution, the Civil War, is they erected this full-fledged corporation called the United States on top of the sovereign house of America. And then delegated, okay, well, you're a citizen of the U.S., well, you can't be a citizen of a corporation. You can only be a franchisee member of that corporation. And once they established that, and they stood around and waited, they waited till 1873, like you said, and they basically stood in the crowd and they watched and they looked around and they said, okay, nobody's throwing a fit, nobody's shooting us, nobody's hanging us, let's see what we can do now. Once they took that aspect, because consent, that's what it says in the Declaration of Independence, is that all just forms of government derive their powers to the consent of the governed. So that's what they did. They waited. Does anyone want to challenge U.S. citizenship?
So our silence was consent.
Your silence was consent, and then they proceeded to do just what you said again, so they brought the lawyers in. If everybody's okay with not being people anymore and we're now corporate franchisees, well, let's argue for corporate rights. And they started creating corporations and giving them civil rights, just like the other U.S. citizens. But the problem is that civil rights, I mean, they're just that. They're granted by the government, and they can be taken away by the government. And simply by saying, I'm a U.S. citizen, you've given consent to the over 100 years of slavery, of this new form of slavery. So, and that's, it's an ideological struggle that I try to educate people on, and sometimes I have difficulty speaking to different levels of education. But I know I know when you actually start to break this thing down and logically work through the steps, everybody in every country, birth certificates, social security numbers, you all are enrollments of beneficiaries of a central bank. And I don't care what country you're in, even the countries that don't have American central banks and don't use American currency as their peg, but they do. Let's say they sell oil. You're an oil-based country. What's the petrodollar? Therefore, you're enrolled as a beneficiary simply by using that federal system, and you are now owned by them.
Right.
Are you still with me?
Yeah, I sort of lost your sound there for a minute, but you're back. So the birth certificates, when did that start? Was that with the 14th Amendment, shortly after the 14th Amendment? Did they start issuing birth certificates?
Well, it came right at the change from 1871 to 1872. The government sat down and said, we have to keep track
of our property.
The one guy said, we have to keep track of all the stuff that we own.
Yeah, us, the people.
The people. And basically then another guy said, well, once we have track of everything, we can apply. Another lawyer from Britain decided, well, we can argue income tax, or corporate tax at the time is what they called it, because the government could tax corporations. Well, now if you as an independent individual are attesting to be a corporation, then we can then tax that. But how are we going to do that? So that's where it gave birth to the creature from Jekyll Island, where you started to see a new central bank to be developed that would come out in the 1900s. But yes, in 1872, they started issuing these birth certificates to U.S. citizens, which at that time was 99% of the blacks. And they had no formal education after hundreds of years of being slaves. They had no formal education to understand how contracts worked, or what they did, or what it meant, or what their rights were, or what their powers were. Most of them couldn't even read the words on the page. And some idiot lawyer said, oh yeah, just make your mark right there.
Right. Okay, so the birth certificate, is that when the straw man was created?
Yes, the birth certificate.
So it has to do with the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment is what essentially made us slaves. We acquiesced through our silence. We lacked, so we essentially consented to this by not standing up and opposing it. And we got tricked into getting birth certificates issued by the government, which essentially sold our children into bondage. Against the will of the child doesn't even know this, but mommy and daddy, thinking, oh, we're doing the right thing, getting our child, registered, which comes from the word regis, meaning, regal, crown, the whole thing, basically signing over their child as property to the crown. And I've heard that people say, if you pull out your original birth certificate, if you could see it, it would have stamps from banks all over the world, because they float these things as some sort of a trading commodity, a financial instrument, where they actually issue money based on the the property as the collateral. The human being is the collateral on the loans to these big banks or central banks.
Absolutely. That most people don't realize that your birth certificate is the contractual agreement of a trust. Your birth certificate is a trust instrument. What is a trust? A trust
you're going out
really is a bond.
Okay, a trust is a bond.
Once you understand that, a trust is a bond, and once you understand that your birth certificate signifies a government bond, this bond is then utilized around the world as collateral, but it sits in an account and it generates interest, and this is what they build loans and extrapolate this supposed growth off of. But what it is when we look at it is the straw man and these things were given birth at that time, and your birth certificate is an enrollment. You are giving the property over. And to talk about the original birth certificates, whenever you flip the original over and you look at the back, there's going to be columns. Down the right side, you'll see printed word from typewriters or computers, whatever it is today, and you'll see all of these denotated stamps all over the place, up the right column. And don't know what any of them are.
Mm-hmm.
But it's easy to know because in the left column, in red, you have written every single name of every central bank that has ever touched that contract, and every single central bank which has some controlling interest in that contract, and that contract is you.
Mm-hmm. Now, if anybody listening, if that doesn't send chills down your spine, it should. There's something wrong with you. You need to recheck your consciousness, because these people are literally saying we are property, we are slaves, we are to be done with whatever they want, whatever they choose. They are above us.